Rose of Cimarron, the girl who defied death for love. In 1893, in a dusty Oklahoma town called Ingalls, federal marshals surrounded a hotel where some of America's most wanted outlaws were hiding. Bullets flew through the air like rain. Men screamed and died in the streets. And then something happened that would become legend. A teenage girl ran straight into that battlefield, crossing through gunfire that was tearing apart buildings and bodies, carrying ammunition and rifles to save the man she loved. Her name was Rose Dunn, but the world would remember her as Rose of Cimarron, the girl whose courage in the face of death made her an icon of the Wild West's final days. She was only 15 years old. The man she saved was George Bitter Creek Newcomb, one of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. What happened that day would make her famous, hunted by law enforcement, and eventually betrayed by her own family in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. This is the true story of Rose Dunn, not just what she did, but who she was, why she risked everything for love, and how her story reveals the violent, passionate, and tragic reality of life on America's last frontier. Rose Dunn was born in 1878 in what would become Oklahoma Territory, a place that wasn't quite a state yet, wasn't quite lawful, and attracted people who couldn't or wouldn't live by society's rules. This was Indian Territory, land that the United States government had designated for Native American tribes, but white settlers were already pushing in, claiming land, building ranches, and establishing their own rough justice. The Dunn family farm sat in this borderland between civilization and chaos. Rose's father worked the land, trying to build something legitimate from Oklahoma's red dirt and endless grasslands. But legitimacy wasn't the path all the Dunn children chose. Rose had 5 older brothers, and most of them lived in the gray zone between law-abiding citizens and outlaws. Growing up in this environment meant Rose learned early that violence was currency and reputation was survival. Her brothers taught her to ride horses before she could properly read. They showed her how to handle firearms when other girls her age were learning to sew and cook. The Dunn household operated under frontier rules. Be tough, be loyal to family, and handle your own problems without running to authorities who might not arrive for days anyway. The landscape itself shaped Rose's character. Oklahoma Territory was vast grassland, broken by red rock formations and carved by rivers. The Cimarron River ran through this country, wild, unpredictable, sometimes dry and sometimes flooding. It became the metaphor for Rose herself. Beautiful, dangerous, impossible to control. By the time Rose reached her teenage years, she had developed into a striking young woman. Accounts describe her as beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that could shift from gentle to fierce in moments. But her appearance was only part of her appeal. She moved with confidence unusual for girls of that era, rode horses like she'd been born in the saddle, and showed no fear of the rough men who passed through her family's property. The Dunn Ranch became known as a safe house for outlaws. This wasn't unusual in Oklahoma Territory, where the line between legitimate rancher and criminal was often blurred. Families would provide meals, fresh horses, and information to outlaws in exchange for money or protection. The Dunn brothers had connections to various outlaw gangs, particularly the group led by Bill Doolin, men who robbed banks and trains across the territory. Rose absorbed this dual existence naturally. During the day, she might help with farm chores, tend animals, or work in the garden like any ranch girl. But she also kept watch for lawmen approaching, helped hide stolen horses, and listened carefully when outlaws gathered at the ranch to plan their next moves. She was learning to live in 2 worlds simultaneously, the world of respectable society and the shadow world of outlaws and gunfighters. This upbringing gave Rose skills that most young women of her era never developed. She understood how outlaws thought and operated. She knew the geography of hideouts and escape routes. She could read danger in the way horses moved or dust rose on the horizon. And she had learned the most important lesson of frontier survival. Loyalty to your people was everything, even when your people lived outside the law. The Dunn family's relationship with outlaws wasn't purely transactional. These were often men her brothers knew personally, men who shared meals at their table and told stories by their fire. In this world, outlaws weren't necessarily evil. They were men who had chosen or been forced onto a different path, men who lived by courage and died by violence. Men who represented a kind of freedom that settled society was trying to eliminate. George Newcomb arrived in Rose Dunn's life sometime in the early 1890s, when she was around 14 or 15 years old. He was a member of the Doolin-Dalton Gang, one of the most notorious outlaw groups operating in Oklahoma Territory. His nickname, Bitter Creek, came from his hometown in Wyoming, but it suited his personality. Tough, hard to navigate, potentially dangerous. Newcomb was in his mid-20s when he met Rose, already a seasoned outlaw with a reputation for being quick with a gun and loyal to his gang. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but he had the charisma that dangerous men often possess. Confidence born from surviving situations that killed weaker men. Intensity that made people pay attention when he spoke. Their meeting happened at the Dunn Ranch during one of the gang's visits. Accounts vary on the details, but what's clear is that something immediate sparked between the teenage girl and the outlaw. For Rose, Newcomb represented adventure, passion, and escape from the limited options available to women in her world. For Newcomb, Rose offered something he rarely experienced: genuine connection with someone who understood his life without judging it. The age difference between them would be deeply troubling by modern standards. A man in his 20s pursuing a 14 or 15-year-old girl. But in 1890s frontier society, girls married young, and age gaps in relationships were common, especially in rough territories where traditional social structures barely existed. This doesn't make it acceptable by today's understanding, but it reflects the harsh realities of that time and place. Their relationship developed quickly and intensely. Newcomb began visiting the Dunn Ranch more frequently, ostensibly to see Rose's brothers, but actually to spend time with Rose. She was drawn into his world, the world of midnight rides, hidden camps, and constant movement to stay ahead of lawmen. He taught her the outlaw's perspective, that banks and railroads were stealing from common people, that lawmen were often corrupt, that the system was rigged against people like them. Rose became useful to the gang in ways that adult men couldn't be. A teenage girl aroused no suspicion when she rode into town, visited the general store, or chatted with locals. She could gather information about marshal movements, identify strangers who might be bounty hunters, and carry messages between gang members. Her innocence was her disguise, and she used it effectively. But Rose's involvement went deeper than practical assistance. She was falling in love with George Newcomb, in the intense, all-consuming way that teenagers love, without reservation, without calculating consequences, without protecting her heart. Every time he left the ranch to ride with the gang, she worried he wouldn't return. Every time he came back, wounded or exhausted or triumphant, she felt relief so powerful, it was almost painful. Newcomb gave Rose a Winchester rifle as a gift, teaching her to shoot it with accuracy that impressed even her brothers. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was practical preparation for the life they might live together. A life where she would need to defend herself, and perhaps him. The rifle symbolized their relationship. Dangerous, powerful, built for survival rather than comfort. Rose's family had complicated reactions to her relationship with Newcomb. Her brothers understood outlaw life and didn't judge Newcomb for his choices. But they also recognized that Rose was getting deeper into a dangerous world. Her parents, trying to maintain some connection to respectable society, disapproved but couldn't control their strong-willed daughter. The community began to notice Rose's connection to the outlaws. Gossip spread about the Dunn girl who was sweet on Bitter Creek Newcomb. Some people viewed it romantically, the Wild West version of forbidden love. Others saw it as shameful, a young woman throwing away her reputation and future for a criminal who would probably die violently before he turned 30. Rose didn't care about community judgment. She had found something that made her feel truly alive. Passionate love, combined with dangerous adventure. She was no longer just a rancher's daughter in a dusty territory. She was Rose, the woman who belonged with outlaws, who understood their world, who chose excitement over safety and love over reputation. September 1st, 1893, began as an ordinary late summer day in Ingalls, Oklahoma Territory. The small town consisted of a few buildings along a single street, a hotel, saloon, general store, and blacksmith shop serving the surrounding ranches and farms. But Ingalls had a secret that day. Several members of the Doolin gang were staying at Ransom's hotel, believing they were safe in this remote location. They were wrong. Federal marshals had received information about the gang's location and planned a surprise attack. Around noon, a force of heavily armed lawmen moved into position, surrounding the hotel and nearby buildings. Their plan was simple: trap the outlaws inside and force surrender, or kill them trying to escape. The first shots shattered the peaceful afternoon. Arkansas Tom Jones was upstairs in the hotel when he spotted the marshals. He opened fire, killing one lawman immediately. The outlaws on the ground floor grabbed their weapons and ran for cover. Within minutes, the streets of Ingalls became a battlefield. George Bitter Creek Newcomb was caught in the worst position. He ran from the hotel toward the stable where horses were kept, but martial fire cut him off. He dove behind a water trough, returning fire with his revolver, but he was pinned down, wounded, and running low on ammunition. Every time he tried to move, bullets kicked up dust around him or splintered the wood of his cover. This is where Rose Dunn enters the historical record in the most dramatic way possible. Accounts vary on exact details, but the core story remains consistent across multiple sources. Rose was either at her family's ranch nearby or possibly in Ingalls itself when the shooting started. When she learned that Bitter Creek was trapped and wounded, she made a decision that would define her entire life. She ran into that battlefield. 15 years old, she crossed open ground while federal marshals were shooting at outlaws and outlaws were shooting back. Witnesses reported seeing a young woman with dark hair running through the chaos, seemingly oblivious to the death flying through the air around her. She carried ammunition belts and a rifle, supplies that Bitter Creek desperately needed. The image of Rose running through Gunfire has become legendary, reproduced in countless retellings, paintings, and later films. But imagining the actual experience reveals its true courage. The sound of rifles cracking, bullets hitting wood and earth, men screaming in pain and rage, smoke and dust making it hard to see clearly. Walking into that chaos required either insane recklessness or love so powerful it overwhelmed survival instinct. Rose reached Bitter Creek's position. She handed him the ammunition and rifle, possibly the same Winchester he had given her. With fresh supplies, Newcomb could fight more effectively. Some accounts say Rose also provided covering fire, shooting at marshals to keep them pinned, while Bitter Creek prepared to escape. Whether she actually fired the rifle or simply delivered supplies, her action was extraordinary. The battle lasted hours. 3 marshals died, and several outlaws were wounded. Eventually, most of the gang escaped, including Bitter Creek Newcomb. They fled Ingalls on horseback, leaving behind destroyed buildings, dead men, and a story that newspapers across the country would soon be reporting. Rose's role in that escape spread quickly. Lawmen who witnessed a young woman helping the outlaws reported it to their superiors. Townspeople who saw her run through the battle told and retold the story, each retelling perhaps adding dramatic details. Newspapers picked up the account, and suddenly Rose Dunn was famous, or infamous, depending on perspective. After the Battle of Ingalls, newspapers began publishing accounts of the girl who saved the outlaws. Journalists loved the story because it contained everything readers wanted: young love, desperate courage, Wild West violence, and a beautiful heroine who defied both law and conventional feminine behavior. The story sold newspapers across the country. Someone, possibly a romantic journalist, possibly Rose herself, gave her the name that would outlive her actual identity: Rose of Cimarron. The name was perfect. It referenced the Cimarron River that ran through her territory, but it also carried symbolic weight. Like the river, she was beautiful, wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. The name transformed her from Rose Dunn, rancher's daughter, into Rose of Cimarron, outlaw heroine. The name stuck in public imagination, partly because it fit established patterns of Wild West storytelling. Americans were fascinated by outlaws, especially outlaws who seemed to embody freedom from social constraints. Female outlaws were particularly intriguing because they violated gender expectations so completely. Women were supposed to be domestic, gentle, law-abiding. A woman who ran through gunfire to save her outlaw lover represented everything Victorian society claimed women couldn't and shouldn't be. Rose became a character in dime novels, cheap, sensational books that told exaggerated stories of Western adventure. These novels portrayed her as a sharp-shooting beauty who rode with outlaws by choice, defended her man against impossible odds, and lived by her own rules. Most of these stories had little connection to actual events, but they spread the legend of Rose of Cimarron far beyond Oklahoma territory. The publicity brought unwanted attention from law enforcement. Federal marshals began investigating Rose's connections to the Doolin gang. They questioned whether she had simply made one dramatic gesture or was actively involved in outlaw activities. Evidence suggested the latter. She had been seen with gang members multiple times, possibly carried messages, definitely knew about their hideouts. A warrant was issued for Rose's arrest as an accomplice to the Doolin gang. Suddenly, the romantic heroine of newspaper stories was a wanted fugitive. She couldn't return openly to her family's ranch without risking arrest. She couldn't travel freely through towns where marshals might recognize her. Her dramatic action at Ingalls had made her famous, but fame came with the price of becoming a target. Rose went into hiding with Bitter Creek Newcomb. They moved between outlaw camps in remote areas of Oklahoma and surrounding territories. They slept in caves, abandoned cabins, and sometimes just under the stars. They relied on the network of outlaw sympathizers for food, supplies, and warnings about martial movements. This was the reality behind the romantic legend. Cold, hungry, constantly afraid, always moving. By 1895, pressure on the Doolin gang had intensified dramatically. The federal government was determined to eliminate organized outlaw activity in Oklahoma Territory as the region moved toward eventual statehood. Bounties on gang members increased substantially. $5,000 for information leading to the capture or killing of major figures like Bitter Creek Newcomb. In 1895, $5,000 represented years of income for working families. Rose's brothers, B. and Dal Dunn, made a decision that would destroy their sister's trust forever. They decided to become bounty hunters, targeting the very outlaws who had been their friends and guests. The motivation was partly financial. Bounty money could transform their economic situation. But it was also practical survival. As law enforcement pressure increased, families known to shelter outlaws faced prosecution themselves. The Dunn brothers' plan required getting close to their targets, and they had perfect bait: their sister. They knew Bitter Creek Newcomb trusted them because of his relationship with Rose. They knew where the couple might hide. They could use family connection to arrange a meeting that outlaws would never suspect was a trap. Rose knew nothing of her brother's decision. When they sent word that Bitter Creek could safely come to the family ranch to recover from recent wounds and get proper food and rest, she believed it. Why wouldn't she? These were her brothers. She had grown up with them, trusted them completely. The possibility that they would betray her and the man she loved for money probably never entered her mind. In May 1895, George Bitter Creek Newcomb and fellow outlaw Charlie Pierce arrived at the Dunn ranch. They came openly, expecting safety among friends. Rose was likely there, happy to see Bitter Creek, relieved he had found temporary sanctuary. For a brief moment, everything seemed fine. They would rest, heal, and then move on to the next hideout. The Dunn brothers were waiting with rifles. As soon as Newcomb and Pierce dismounted from their horses, gunfire erupted. The outlaws had no chance to defend themselves or even draw their weapons. They were killed instantly in what amounted to an execution, shot down by men they had considered friends. The details of what happened immediately after the shooting are disputed, but several accounts mention Rose's reaction. Witnesses reported hearing a woman screaming, screams of grief so intense they were heard across the ranch property. Rose had watched the man she loved murdered by her own brothers, killed for money, while he trusted them enough to let his guard down. Some reports say Rose tried to protect Bitter Creek's body, throwing herself over it and refusing to let her brothers move it. Other accounts claim she attacked her brothers physically, scratching and hitting them in rage and grief. What's certain is that her emotional response was powerful enough that people present remembered and reported it years later. The Dunn brothers loaded the bodies of Newcomb and Pierce onto a wagon and transported them to town to claim their bounty money. $5,000 for the two outlaws, a fortune by frontier standards. They had successfully completed their first major bounty hunting operation, killing men who had eaten at their table and trusted their family. Rose's world had shattered completely. The man she loved was dead, murdered by her own brothers. Her family had chosen money over loyalty to her. Her reputation was destroyed, known to lawmen as an outlaw accomplice, known in outlaw circles as the sister of betrayers. She had nowhere to go and no one to trust. Federal marshals arrested Rose shortly after the killings. She was charged with conspiracy and providing aid to known criminals. The evidence against her was substantial. Witnesses had seen her with gang members, she had clearly been at Ingalls during the battle, and her relationship with Bitter Creek Newcomb was well documented. She faced serious prison time. The newspapers that had romanticized Rose of Cimarron now reported her arrest with mixture of fascination and judgment. Some portrayed her as a tragic figure, destroyed by doomed love. Others presented her as a criminal who deserved punishment. All agreed she made compelling news, the beautiful outlaw girl brought down by family betrayal and lost love. Rose Dunn was convicted and sent to a women's reformatory in Framingham, Massachusetts, far from Oklahoma, far from everything she had known. The choice of location was deliberate. Authorities wanted her away from outlaw sympathizers and family connections that might help her escape. At 16 or 17 years old, Rose entered a world completely different from the wide spaces and frontier roughness of Oklahoma. The reformatory was designed to transform wayward women into proper, submissive, domesticated citizens. Rose had to wear institutional clothing, follow strict schedules, perform domestic labor, and attend religious services. Everything about the place was meant to break the wild spirit that had made her Rose of Cimarron and rebuild her as an acceptable woman by society's standards. Newspapers continued to write about her, though she was no longer accessible for interviews. They called her the beautiful bandit girl and speculated about whether prison would reform or destroy her. Some articles romanticized her story, presenting her as a tragic heroine punished for the crime of loving too passionately. Others insisted she deserved harsh punishment for choosing outlaws over law. Inside the reformatory, Rose's behavior surprised authorities. Prison records describe her as quiet, obedient, and hard-working, nothing like the wild girl who had run through Gunfire to save an outlaw. She learned skills the reformatory taught: proper sewing, refined cooking, household management. She attended educational classes and religious instruction without apparent resistance. This transformation might have been genuine evolution, Rose recognizing that her outlaw life had led only to loss and grief, deciding to embrace a different path. Or it might have been strategic performance, a smart young woman figuring out that compliance would earn early release. Probably it was both. Rose was learning that survival sometimes meant adapting to circumstances rather than fighting them. After serving 2 years of her sentence, Rose was released for good behavior. She was still a teenager when she walked out of that Massachusetts reformatory, but she had aged far beyond her years. She had experienced passionate love, violent loss, family betrayal, and imprisonment. She had been famous as an outlaw heroine and infamous as a criminal. Now she faced the challenge of building some kind of normal life from the wreckage. Rose Dunn returned to Oklahoma Territory, determined to disappear. She wanted no part of her former identity as Rose of Cimarron. That name represented pain, loss, and a life she couldn't return to even if she wanted. She needed to become someone new, someone ordinary, someone forgettable. She succeeded remarkably well. Rose met and married a man named Charles Noble. He was involved in local politics and farming, respectable, law-abiding, everything that George Bitter Creek Newcomb had not been. Their marriage represented Rose's deliberate choice to embrace conventional life after years of living outside social boundaries. As Mrs. Charles Noble, Rose worked hard to establish herself as a proper, respectable woman. She managed her household efficiently, using skills learned both in her frontier childhood and in the reformatory. She participated in community activities appropriate for a politician's wife. She was courteous, reserved, and utterly unremarkable. When journalists occasionally tracked her down seeking interviews about her outlaw past, Rose refused every request. She would not discuss the Battle of Ingalls, would not talk about Bitter Creek Newcomb, would not confirm or deny the stories published about Rose of Cimarron. Her refusal was absolute and consistent. That life was over, and she intended to leave it buried. Rose destroyed every physical reminder of her past that she could find. Photographs of her with Bitter Creek, letters he had written, the Winchester rifle he had given her, all were burned or thrown away. She was erasing Rose of Cimarron as completely as possible, leaving only Mrs. Charles Noble, respectable wife and community member. This reinvention required constant vigilance. She had to monitor what she said, how she reacted, what memories she allowed herself to revisit. She had to pretend that part of her life had never happened, even though it had shaped everything about who she was. She had to perform normalcy so convincingly that eventually it might become real. More than a century after the Battle of Ingalls, historians continue debating what actually happened that day in September 1893. The core question remains: did Rose Dunn really run through Gunfire to deliver ammunition to Bitter Creek Newcomb? Or was the story exaggerated or invented by sensationalist newspapers? Evidence supporting the story exists in multiple sources. Law enforcement reports from the battle mention a young woman being present and providing assistance to the outlaws. Townspeople who witnessed the battle reported seeing a girl running through the shooting. These accounts were recorded close to the actual events, before the legend had fully developed. However, some historians argue the story was embellished beyond recognition. Newspaper accounts in the 1890s were notoriously unreliable, often inventing details to make stories more dramatic and sell more papers. The romantic image of a beautiful girl risking death for love was exactly the kind of narrative that frontier newspapers loved to promote, whether fully true or not. The reality probably lies between extreme skepticism and complete acceptance of the legend. Something happened at Ingalls involving Rose Dunn, enough that lawmen noticed and reported it, enough that she was later arrested for her involvement. Whether she made one dramatic run through crossfire or multiple trips, whether she fired shots herself or just delivered ammunition, the core truth remains. A teenage girl chose to help outlaws during a violent battle, risking her life in the process. Comparing Rose to other women of the Wild West provides context. Belle Starr, Pearl Hart, Cattle Annie, and Little Britches all were women who violated gender expectations and became legends partly through their own actions and partly through journalistic exaggeration. The Wild West created space for these women to exist, and American culture's fascination with frontier freedom ensured their stories would be retold. Rose's story influenced later Western entertainment significantly. Songs, films, and novels borrowed elements of her legend: the loyal outlaw woman, the dramatic rescue under fire, the tragic love story. Gene Autry recorded a song called Rose of the Cimarron in 1951. The legend had fully separated from the historical person, becoming a story that could be reshaped for each new generation's understanding of courage and love. The few verified photographs of Rose Dunn show a young woman with dark hair and direct gaze, attractive but not the breathtaking beauty that legend described. The photos reveal someone who looks capable of both the wildness and the later respectability that marked her life. They ground the legend in actual human reality. Rose Dunn Noble died peacefully in 1955 at age 76 in Washington State, far from the Oklahoma Territory where she had lived her dramatic youth. She had successfully created a quiet, conventional life that lasted far longer than her years as Rose of Cimarron. By the time she died, the Wild West she had known had been gone for decades, transformed into highways, cities, and modern civilization. She was among the last living witnesses to the actual Wild West, that brief period between roughly 1865 and 1895 when the American frontier was genuinely lawless, genuinely violent, and genuinely wild. Most people who had experienced that era as adults were long dead. Rose had survived into an era of television, interstate highways, and nuclear weapons, carrying memories of a world that seemed almost mythical. Her grave was eventually located in Washington State. Unlike the elaborate monuments that mark some Wild West figures, Rose's burial place is modest, marked with her married name rather than the legend she had tried so hard to forget. This simplicity reflects her conscious choice to be remembered as a normal woman who lived a normal life, not as Rose of Cimarron. For modern audiences in the United States, Canada, and Europe, Rose's story carries multiple meanings. She represents courage, the willingness to risk everything for what she loved. She demonstrates the power of second chances, the possibility of completely reinventing yourself after devastating loss. She embodies the tensions between individual freedom and social conformity that continue to challenge societies today. Her story also raises uncomfortable questions. Was it courage or recklessness that sent her into that gunfire? Was it love or foolishness to commit herself to a doomed outlaw? Was she a victim of her brother's greed, or someone who brought trouble on herself through her choices? These questions don't have simple answers, and that complexity makes Rose Dunn more interesting than simple hero worship would allow. The lesson of loyalty runs throughout Rose's story. She remained loyal to Bitter Creek, even when that loyalty put her in danger. Her brothers violated family loyalty for money. Rose later demonstrated loyalty to her new life by refusing to profit from her past notoriety. Loyalty to people, to values, to chosen identity was the thread connecting her dramatic phases. The possibility of reinvention matters too. Rose proved that even after being famous as an outlaw, imprisoned and marked by tragedy, someone could build an entirely new life. She demonstrated that you're not trapped forever by your past, though escaping it requires determination and sacrifice. For people struggling with their own difficult pasts, Rose's successful transformation offers genuine hope. Rose Dunn was not simply a flower in the prairie, beautiful but passive. She was the heart of Oklahoma history. Courage and tragedy, wildness and redemption. The kind of person who only existed in that brief moment when the American frontier was closing, but hadn't quite closed. She chose her path, paid its price, and ultimately survived to die peacefully, decades after the world that made her had vanished. That survival might be her most remarkable achievement of all.